Hi, for today's story I'm sat here in the middle of the Peak District with this wonderful view out the background. It's a Sunday morning, there's so many lovely sounds around, but what I want to do today is I'm going to read a chapter from The Hobbit. So chapter 6, Out of the Frying Pan into the Fire. Bilbo had escaped the goblins, but he did not know where he was. He had lost hood, cloak, food, pony, his buttons and his friends. He wandered on till the sun began to sink westwards behind the mountains. Their shadows fell across Bilbo's path, and he looked back. Then he looked forward, and he could see before him only ridges and slopes, before towards lowlands and plains glimpsed, occasionally between the trees. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed. "I seem to have got right on the other side of the misty mountains, right to the edge of the land beyond. Where and oh, where can Gandalf and the dwarves have got to? I can only hope to goodness they are not still back there in the power of the goblins." He still wandered on, out of the little high valley, over its edge and down the slopes beyond. But all the while, a very uncomfortable thought was growing inside him. He wondered whether he ought to or not. Now he had the magic ring, to go back to the horrible, horrible tunnels and look for his friends. He had just made up his mind that it was his duty, that he must turn back, and very miserable he felt about it when he heard voices. He stopped and listened. It did not sound like goblins, so he crept forward carefully. He was on his stony path winding downward with a rocky wall on the left hand. On the other side the ground sloped away, and there were dells below the level of the path, overhung with bushes and low trees. In one of these dells, under the bushes, people were talking. He crept still nearer, and suddenly he saw peering between two big boulders ahead with a red hood on. It was Balin doing lookout. He could have clapped and shouted for joy, but he did not. He had still got the ring on, for the fear of meeting something unexpected and unpleasant, and he saw that Balin was looking straight at him without noticing him. "I'll give them all a surprise," he thought, as he crawled into the bushes at the edge of the dell. Gandalf was arguing with the dwarfs. They were discussing all that had happened to them in the tunnels, and wondering and debating what they were to do now. The dwarves were grumbling, and Gandalf was saying they could not possibly go on with their journey, leaving Mr. Baggins in the hands of the goblins, without trying to find out if he was alive or dead, and without trying to rescue him. "After all, he is my friend," said the wizard, "and not a bad little chap. I feel responsible for him. I wish to goodness you had not lost him." The dwarves wanted to know why he had ever been brought at all, why he could not stick to his friends and come along with them, and why the wizard had not chosen someone with more sense. "He has been more trouble than use so far," said one. "If we've got to go back now into those abominable tunnels to look for them, then drat him, I say." Gandalf answered angrily, "I bought him, and I don't bring things that are of no use. Either you can help me to look for him, or I can go and leave you here to get out of the fine mess as best as you can yourselves. If we can only find him again, you will thank him before all is over. Whatever did you want to go and drop him for, Dory?" "You would have dropped him," said Dory, "if a goblin had grabbed your legs from behind in the dark, tripped up your feet and kicked you in the back. Then why didn't you pick him up again? Good heavens, can you ask? Goblins fighting and biting in the dark, everyone falling over bodies and hitting one another. You nearly chopped off my head with Glamdring, and Thorin was stabbing here, there and everywhere with Orcrist. All of a sudden you gave one of your blinding flashes, and we saw all the goblins running back yelping. You shouted, 'Follow me, everybody,' and everybody ought to have followed. We thought everybody had. There was no time to count, as you know quite well, till we had dashed through the gate guards, out to the lower door, and helter-skelter down here. And here we are, without the burglar, confiscate him. And here's the burglar, and Bilbo stepping down in the middle of them and slipping off the ring. Bless me, how they jumped. Then they shouted with surprise and delight. Gandalf was as astonished as any of them, but probably more pleased than all the others. he called to Balin and told him what he thought of a lookout who let people walk right into them like that without warning. It is a fact that Bilbo's reputation went up a very great deal with the dwarves after this. If they had still doubted that he was really a first-class burglar, in spite of Gandalf's words, they doubted no longer. Balin was the first most puzzled of all, but everyone said it was a very clever bit of work. Indeed, Bilbo was so pleased with their praise that he just chuckled inside and said nothing whatsoever about the ring. And when they asked him how he did it, he said, "Oh, just crept along, very carefully and quietly." "Well, it is the first time that even a mouse has crept along carefully and quietly under my very nose and not been spotted," said Balin. "And I take my hood off to you," which he did. "Balin, at your service," said he. "Your servant," said Mr. Baggins, and Bilbo. Then he wanted to know all about his adventures after they had lost him, and he sat down and told them everything, except about finding of the ring. Not just now, he thought. They were particularly interested in the riddle competition, and shuddered most appreciatively at his description of Gollum. "Then I couldn't think of another question, with him sitting beside me," ended Bilbo, "and so I said, 'What's in my pocket?' He couldn't guess in 3 goes. So I said, 'What about your promise? Show me the way out.' But he came at me to kill me, and I ran and fell over, and he missed me in the dark. And then I followed him, because I heard him talking to himself. He thought I really knew the way out, so he was making for it. And then he sat down in the entrance, and I could not get by. So I jumped over him and escaped, and ran down to the gate." "What about the guards?" they asked. "Weren't there any?" "Oh yes, lots of them, but I dodged them. And I got stuck in the door, which was only open a crack, and I lost lots of buttons," he said sadly, looking at his torn clothes. "But I squeezed through all right, and here I am." The dwarves looked at him with quite a new respect, where he talked about dodging guards, jumping over Gollum, and squeezing through, as if it was not very difficult or alarming. "What did I tell you?" said Gandalf, laughing. "Mr. Baggins has more about him than you guess." He gave Bilbo a queer look from under his busy eyebrows as he said this, and the Hobbit wondered if he had guessed at the part of his tale that he had left out. Then he had questions of his own to ask, for if Gandalf had explained it all by now to the dwarves, Bilbo had not heard it. He wanted to know how the wizard had turned up again, and where they had all got to now. The wizard, to tell you the truth, never minded explaining his cleverness more than once. So now he told Bilbo that both he and Elrond had been well aware of the presence of evil goblins in the part of the mountains, but their main gate used to come out on different paths, one more easy to travel by, so that often get caught by people benighted near their gates. Evidently, people had given up their going that way, and the goblins must have opened the new entrance to the top of the pass the dwarves had taken, quite recently, because it had been quite safe to do so. "I must say, if I can't find a more or less decent giant to block it up again," said Gandalf, "or soon there will be no getting over the mountains at all." As soon as Gandalf had heard Bilbo's yell, he realised what had happened. In the flash which killed the goblins that were grabbing him, he had just nipped inside the crack, just as it snapped to. He followed after the drivers and the prisoners right to the edge of the Great Hall, and there he sat down and worked up the best magic he could in the shadows. A very ticklish business it was, he said, touch and go. But of course Gandalf had made a special study of bewitchments with fire and lights. Even the hobbits had never forgotten the magic words of old Tuck's Midsummer Eve parties, as you remember. The rest we all know, except that Gandalf knew all about the back door, as the goblins called the lower gate, where Bilbo lost his buttons. I really like that book, and I must say, sat out here is so peaceful. It really is. It's a little bit chilly. I must say, I think I should have put my coat on, but I hope you enjoyed this story. Thanks for joining me today.